Audience, it is the 4th of June, and it has been a while since we've had one of our regular guests on. It's Dave Huguenel, and Dave is a major consultant here in the political circles in the United States, and is very familiar with Oregon. So we're going to talk some Oregon. We're going to talk some national politics. He was in the Trump war room in 2020, and he has got his finger on the pulse of many races across the country, as well as a lot of insight into the things that we only see from the front end in the news. And he knows kind of what it looks like and what it sounds like in the back end of all these campaign operations. Welcome to the show, Dave, and welcome back.
Always glad to be here. Wish I could be there in person so I could get my Dutch brothers fixed. Unfortunately, we do not have that on the East Coast yet. So part of the reason I work in Oregon is so I can travel 3,000 miles or 6,000 both ways to get a nice cup of coffee.
Right. Well, and we're glad that actually is one of the things that are going to attract you to Oregon. There are some things we've been doing here in Oregon that haven't made people feel attracted to the state, and but that's why we're in this, to elect new people and to keep some people that we need to keep there in order to make sure that Oregon reaches its full potential, because we can do more than coffee, actually, if we put our mind to it.
I have no doubt. No doubt. But your coffee game is A+.
All right. Well, so yeah, I think it's been a few months. I think it's been since probably February. I know I've been really busy with a big campaign here in the 4th District for Congress, Monique Despain, and of course you've had many races that you're working on, and now here in Oregon, once we emerge from the cloud of dust that was the primary, we start aiming very specifically towards the general election. But then there's a lot of stuff that's happened. I think the last time you and I talked, we were kind of speculating that the presidential race would reach its true finality in the Republican primary. The Democrat primary had already reached its finality or run aground, depending on how you look at it. But a lot's happened since then, and we just had some big news developments with President Trump this last week. There's always big news developments with President Biden. Why don't we just kind of get your 30,000-foot helicopter take on what you're seeing happening right now nationally?
I mean, the big number. If I describe what's going on nationally, I stay in the number I kind of fixate on is 34 million. 34 million is what Donald Trump raised in I think less than 24 hours after the guilty verdict came down in New York. So that, to me, that is the 10,000-pound elephant in the room for any candidate, whether you're running for dog catcher or you're running for U.S. Senate or governor, is what is the impact of what's happening nationally here? Because we are definitely in uncharted waters. Anyone that says they know exactly what's going to happen is either clairvoyant or lying, and probably more the latter. But the fact is that you saw this certainly small dollar surge in support for President Trump immediately after the verdict, and there's some public polling coming out right now that's showing that it's not just folks donating money to the campaign; it's people offering their support for the former president for this upcoming general election.
Yeah.
I think it is one of the things I've always kind of talked about with Donald Trump, and I think, and I'm not the only one that said this. I don't mean to make this sound like it's an original thought, but it's a true thought. He kind of defies the laws of political gravity. There are things that happen to him or that he does as a candidate that most consultants would say, hey, you shouldn't do that. But when he does it, good things happen politically for him. His poll numbers go up. He raises more money. He gains more support. And that's kind of what this last week has sort of felt like to me. Is this is another example of President Trump kind of defying the laws of political gravity. And I have no reason to think that that's going to change. If it hasn't changed from 2016 to now, I don't think it's going to change in the next 6 months.
Yeah, it's the old. It's people shouldn't readily think they can just copy what Donald Trump does, because you're not Donald Trump.
Right.
It's like the people that go and think they're going to do karaoke and so I think I'll sing a Beatles song. Don't try to sing a Beatles song in karaoke.
Yeah.
You can't.
You might look like Paul McCartney, but you can't sing like him.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
and I think that the other thing is he has had the tendency to do things that break new ground or um, put people on defensive or lure them into his game, right? And
Right.
so, like, he'll troll people. And normally that's just not a great thing to advise your candidate to spend their time doing. But it's kind of worked for him because then they start reacting to him. And then there's also the fact that, um, you know, he kind of just turns and goes straight into the fire sometimes when other times not every candidate could actually sustain the torrent of, say, attacks and um, negative media that's thrown at him because it seems to make him stronger most of the time, although it doesn't necessarily help him with people that don't like him. Would you say that what's happening right now as we watch, there's going to be fewer and fewer and fewer undecided voters as we get further on into the election? But there are people who have swung already because the polls show that, right?
Sure. Sure. Yeah. I mean, as the country gets more and more partisan, which it really, I mean, we've been becoming more partisan as a country probably since like 2002, 2004, depending on how you measure it. So yes, there are fewer and fewer swing voters. There are some consultants that argue that there is no such thing as a swing voter anymore. It's all just kind of getting out your base and GOTV related. I don't necessarily go to that extreme. There are people that are trying to make up their minds and that are unsure about how they're going to vote in November, and it's worth communicating with them. But the other thing, kind of talking about this phenomenon, what this national atmosphere means for candidates, whether you're running for state rep or state senate, whether you're running in Oregon or you're running in North Carolina, is one of the things as news continues to circulate around Trump, which it certainly will. It's not going to stop. There's
No.
more cases out there. There's more campaigns to be had. There's more things to be said. Democrats can't help themselves but to talk about Trump, and I think that is, one of the ways that I would kind of talk about Trump's success politically is that the more the Democrats only focus on talking about Trump and MAGA extremists and all the stuff that we've seen ad nauseum over the last 6 years or almost 8 years when they campaigned against him, is they start to look tone deaf. Because if you're an average American, you're worried about crime. You're worried about you might be worried about the border. You might be worried about the economy, inflation, things like that. And part of what you're supposed to do on a campaign, especially when you're running for higher office, is try to offer solutions. Like, listen, if you elect me, I'm going to make inflation go down. If you elect me, I'm going to try to reduce crime, or I'm going to try to increase opportunity. Those are the basic tenets of a positive message of any campaign. Yep. Democrats don't allow themselves to do that because they're so fixated on talking about Donald Trump. So if you're a voter and you're an undecided voter and you have a Republican that's saying, here are all the things I'm going to do if you elect me. And you have a Democrat saying, you have to elect me to stop Donald Trump. Well, that doesn't sound like a solution to anything, to any of my real world problems, at least. So that is the environment that I think we're going into nationally. And I think to your point about not acting like Donald Trump, I mean, what Donald Trump does, I think, to a certain extent for any Republican candidate, is it allows you to be your authentic self. You don't, you as a Republican shouldn't be talking about Donald Trump either. You should be talking about your solutions and allow the Democrats to go down that red herring of, talking about Donald Trump and all that sort of stuff. So, and let them be the tone deaf ones.
Yeah. And I think that because they get sucked into what they have defined as the main issue of the election, and they don't address, well, they've had two problems. I think Democrats have had two problems that I've seen. One is that they've not had answers and don't want to talk about the things that address the top issues that people care about, right? So the border and crime and inflation. And we know what many of these things at the top of the list are. And they don't really have answers to them. They are often, in the case of like the border, perceived to be the cause, especially when we're talking about President Biden. And they are now trying to grapple with that, I think, with some of the stuff they're doing, or they think they're doing on the border and the executive orders that Biden's come up with. But it's really late in the game. Like, how do you convince people that you aren't the cause when everybody believes, yeah, you're the cause? Some people are like, well, that's fine, but I hate Donald Trump more. Other people are like, no, Joe Biden's the cause, and I've had it. And so they don't talk about the issues people care about with solutions. And then they talk about sort of the anti-solution that they present, which is, well, at least we're going to stop Donald Trump, right? They do talk about issues that people don't care about except deep into their base. Mm-hmm. And those things rank near the bottom. Like, climate change is not ranking high from what I've seen in the polling at this point. That doesn't mean it doesn't affect some swing voters in some places in the country. But if you said, I'm just going to talk about climate change all the time, and I'm in a district that could go either way, you might have a problem, because that's not at the top of the list, right?
No, the way I look at issues like climate change and those things that might not necessarily be top issues is you'll have voters and you'll have forums and debates if you're a candidate where you might have to answer questions on those sorts of things. What voters, in my mind, tend to look for is that you don't necessarily have to say exactly what they think. They just want to make sure you're not crazy on either end of the spectrum, right?
Yeah.
If you're an average voter, because people do believe that climate change is a concern. It's not necessarily a top concern, but it shows up from time to time, depending on the state, especially in the Pacific Northwest. You see it a lot more out there. They just want to make sure, like, you're not saying we need to shut down, every, get rid of every single, diesel truck and get rid of, just basically go completely green. That's not the right solution that voters typically like. They don't want to hear that at left extreme. They don't want to hear the right extreme either. They just want to know that, look, it's an issue. We gotta kind of clean up after ourselves. There are a lot of different issues like that where I just feel like it's not that you necessarily need to go out of your way to talk about it, but when you do talk about it, you just try to sound like you're not a conspiracy theorist or a whack job.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually did see the other day, we know that one of the big issues in 2022 is the abortion issue, right? And that got a lot of attention. However, it does seem to have one difference from 2022. In the polling I've seen, it's not at the top. It's not like one of the top issues. Now, maybe in some swing districts it is. But does it carry the same weight? Because the Democrats believe that between that and Donald Trump and all the associated extremist labeling that they do, that's how they're going to win the election. It seems they're going to spend $100 million just talking about abortion,
right?
Even in states where it's already the law, and so they talk about all these issues. And so when you have the national picture, and of course, I think President Trump has actually kind of defined the issue for himself as well. He's redefined it, in fact, from where it was before. Are the Democrats onto something, or is this kind of another time that they're going to go all in on something when people are like, well, you know what? I'm concerned about inflation, actually, because I can't afford meat.
So sort of yes and no. I love agreeing and disagreeing at the same time. That's why I'm in politics. But the issue with, again, abortion is a good example. There are a few others that come to mind. But when you see public polling that has here are the top issues nationally or in your state, one of the things you have to remember is that, like we said at the beginning of the show, the country is really partisan right now, right? Where there is this kind of stark contrast of red voters and blue voters. That means that there's a stark contrast in what people think are the most important issues. So, for example, abortion, it might show up as a top 3 issue or a top 5 issue. But if you look at who thinks that is a top issue, it's going to most likely be left-leaning Democrats, right?
Yeah.
Folks that are never going to vote for Republican anyway. And if you go look at Republicans, they might be saying that it's crime or homelessness. And then with swing voters, they might be more worried about the economy. I'm saying this all kind of hypothetical. I'm not going off a specific poll, just kind of just broadly what I've seen in public polling in the past. So you can't necessarily just look at like what are the top issues overall. You really have to look at what are the top issues of voters for whom, because there are going to be Democrats. If you're a Republican running for office, reality is there are people that will never vote for you. You can say exactly what the polling says they care about. You can go and knock on their door. You can have dinner with them. But the bottom line is they are a Democrat and they will never vote for a Republican. And the inverse is true. There are Republicans that will never vote for a Democrat. My grandfather turned 92 2 months ago. He hasn't voted for a Republican in nearly a century now. I'm sorry. I got that backwards. If my grandfather's watching, I'd get in a lot of trouble. He has not voted for a Democrat in nearly a century.
Yeah.
And I don't think in the next 6 months there's any Democrat that's going to go knock on his door and convince him to change his mind, regardless of it, right? So when you think of top issues, you also have to think of, okay, who are saying these are the top issues? Because again, if you look at most polling right now, there's never going to be an issue where 75% of the country agrees this is the number one issue, right? You might see the number one issue is ranked at like 21%, the number two is 15, right? That means that it's these pluralities of specific demographics that are getting enough consensus that theirs is becoming the top one. Sometimes you see some broad concerns, like economics can be one that's a little more broad, but like immigration is one that pops up as a top issue. You tend to see that's mostly a Republican-leaning issue that most Republicans care about. You're starting to see over the last couple of years more independent and swing voters care about that because they're kind of seeing the effects of it,
which has moved it up to a higher level than it used to be.
It's one of the reasons that you have seen it gone up is that it's kind of bleeding over into that sort of middle of the road category in terms of voters. So anyway, that's a long ramble on issues polling. But the top issues, when you see those on public polls, they can be a little deceiving as like, oh, this is a number two issue, I have to talk about it. Not necessarily.
Yeah, and so when you mentioned about the border, I think there is a specific thing happening right now, and we've seen not only that this issue is higher in the list than it used to be, but it's obviously associated with what's been happening at the border. It's not because people's tastes changed. It's because there's actual like a crisis going on at the border. And even many Democrats have admitted it. And even some Democrats who would tend to carry a lot of water for the Biden administration have been saying, you know what, actually, could you do something about this just so we can get through the election? And so today, President Biden announced his executive orders to address illegal immigration and the border. And I think it's just because it's just politics, because when you look at what he's planning to do, it's actually just, it's not stopping what's happening. It's just saying, well, if it gets too much, then we'll maybe shut the border down temporarily till it gets less, and then we'll open it up again. And there were a few other tweaks, but it's window dressing. It's theater, right? Because they want people to, they want talking points. They want to say they're doing something, and Republicans who oppose the bipartisan deals, so to speak, are doing nothing and stopping it. And so it's blame shifting, right?
Look, it is blame shifting. It is certainly kicking the can. But to me, it's telling that, at this point in the campaign cycle, the Biden administration or the Biden campaign, or a mixture of the two, realize that they have to show some sort of movement on the issue. That shows that they know that they are losing support in part because of that. And the reality is, if you're looking at presidential politics, I mean, Arizona is a battleground state that is also a border state. And that is somewhere. And again, I think over the last few years, I think nationally, even if you're not a border state, you've seen or felt some of the effects of illegal immigration, especially in some of the bigger, more urban areas, like even places like New York and DC, that used to love calling themselves a sanctuary city, are kind of walking that back now. But if you're a border state, if you're New Mexico, Southern California, Texas, Arizona, any of those states, the border it's not esoteric. I mean, it is something that you live and breathe every single day, and they've been dealing with this problem for years. So it is a tough road for the Biden administration to. I don't know what they can do at this point to somehow change their image on the border. I think Democrats have branded themselves for so long as being sort of this porous border political party. I don't know how you fix that between June 4th and November 6th or 5th.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like a lot of people already have these perceptions,
Right.
these frames around these issues. And on this one too, uh, it's putting a lie. It's calling their bluff. The Democrats were saying that they needed to have legislation. The president had no power to solve the problem. He needed money and he needed some legal changes. And now he turns around and does an executive order. And the whole thing, when he took office, was done through 93 executive orders to reverse all the Trump administration policies. Specifically, and probably first and foremost, is the Remain in Mexico policy. And they aren't doing that. So it feels like they're just trying to satisfy some people that are hand wringing about the issue, but their heart's not in it. So on top of the fact that it's hard to change voters' minds, maybe they haven't really changed their own minds at all. They just figured, let's just make it look like we're doing something, virtue signaling.
Right. Well, and again, his base is, there's a large plurality, if not a majority, of his political party that wants a porous border, that thinks that we should have basically freewheeling amnesty and just let anyone across. So any movement that he makes to try to rectify that politically with some of these sort of tepid releases on maybe we'll restrict asylum and things like that, that is upsetting people in his own base. So that is that's just the reality of the quagmire that Biden is in right now, is that for every one swing voter he's going to try to convince that, hey, I'm actually better on the border than you think I am, he's going to upset two of his biggest supporters.
Yeah. And also it's becoming obvious that they have that same problem with the Israel Hamas war. And that one is causing a split in their progressive base, particularly the younger vote, like on college campuses, where in some locations that college vote is absolutely critical to them being able to tip a district in a certain direction. So they tried, they've been trying to straddle the line, right, and appear to be supportive and make warm noises towards Israel, but then also like wag their finger and delay or cut off some military aid. And it seems like they're displeasing both segments of supporters at the moment.
No, it is. I have a colorful way of kind of explaining this in campaigns, right? The nice way to say it is that you should never try to paint in pastels, paint in clear primary colors. But one of the things that I think Biden is trying to do, and it makes it to where he loses with everyone, is that he's trying to be half pregnant, and you can't be half pregnant on any issue. Like you have to, you're either 100% on it or you're not. This kind of like, we support Israel, but kind of sort of not really. Like we're not a big fan. Like it's not working for anyone. And where it's left him is that no one thinks he's good on the issue. Yeah. Whereas he could lean in and be like, listen, Israel is and always has been America's largest ally in the Middle East, most important ally in the Middle East. We stand with Israel in them defending their territory. And maybe he would at least get some credit with swing voters and maybe even some right-leaning voters on the issue. And sure, he would ostracize his base a little bit, but hopefully they come around in November. Or he could lean all the way to the left and be like, listen, this is an atrocity. Whatever the Palestinian people like protesters say, whatever their talking points are. He could say all that, and his base would love him for it. And maybe he'd raise some money online, and then all would be great there. Then you have to struggle to get those swing voters in November. But he's like doing neither of those things, and that I think is the bigger political problem.
Well, and they've been taking a lot of broadsides from James Carville, who's the guy that ran Obama's campaign in 2012. No, Axelrod has been saying some things like, I don't know what they're doing, but this isn't working. And of course, Carville was even more direct. The guy's old, is what he's saying. So stop pretending like that problem isn't going to be noticed by people, and come up with a real plan. And then, of course, on this issue that we just, the two issues we just talked about, is bleeding over into all these congressional races, because these the House, controlled by a Republican majority, are pushing forward bills and forcing Democrats, especially in vulnerable seats, to take votes on these bills that would address, correct these problems. Like today, they had this ICC bill, the International Criminal Court, that would sanction the International Criminal Court. Biden at first said he was okay with it, and then he changed his mind. Then a bunch of Democrats voted for it, but a lot more voted against it. And it's essentially an entity that's has issued an arrest warrant for the Israeli prime minister and defense minister. So you're not going to win over Jewish voters very well by taking that position. So they're in a mess there. And then there's the executive order thing, which the NRCC chairman, Richard Hudson, said is too little too late to solve this issue. And that's what you were just saying, essentially, from a political point of view.
Well, and I have to imagine that there's an ad guy that's going to litigate this in a TV commercial at some point for against Joe Biden. But if you kind of step back from what's happening with Israel and Gaza right now, and just kind of look at Biden foreign policy overall, I mean, he is averaging at least one foreign policy blunder a year right now.
Well, right? one new war a year.
Right, because you've got the withdrawal and the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. You've got the war in Ukraine. Now you've got the war in the Middle East. Those are any president wouldn't want to have one of those in their first term. Biden has all three,
and it's not like any of them are over. The after effects and the consequences are still being felt from Afghanistan, and we still got 2 wars going on.
1,000% right. Now, again, when you look at public polling, you're not necessarily seeing any of these bubble up as a top tier issue, because we don't necessarily feel the effects of foreign policy at home. But there are questions that you can ask, and I have no doubt that most Americans have a sort of subconscious concern over the fact that the world feels less safe than it did 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And frankly, like, there's nothing that the Biden administration has done to make us think that they've got a plan to make it any safer anytime soon. And that's the bigger problem for Biden, is that there are no major foreign policy wins to speak of. And you've also got China, a potential conflict with China and Taiwan that seems to be bubbling up more and more every month. That keeps getting worse. There's Russia's acting more and more aggressive in different ways. There's tons of opportunities for foreign policy catastrophe between now and November.
China and Taiwan.
Yes.
Iran could test a nuclear bomb. What are they going to do about it?
Right. And so that is that is also kind of the unknown between now and November, is if there is any more sort of, call it a flare up. I don't feel like that's the right terminology, but it's the one that comes to mind. Some sort of foreign policy flare up between now and November. That's potentially a killer for the Biden campaign.
Yeah.
All it takes is one more, I think, and folks are just kind of fed up. Like, this guy, he's not good. He's not good on domestic policy, and foreign policy is just an absolute disaster.
Yeah. And then throw in the border, where how many gotaways among the millions of gotaways, there could be easily tens of thousands of hostiles that have come across the border in one form or another, and they're actually the reporting is very clear. I heard one. I think it was it Steve Scalise or Tom Emmer that said this morning in a press conference, these aren't the huddled masses of women and children who are starving, yearning to breathe free. It's military age males coming across that border. Some of them might just want a job, but we don't know what all of them want, and we don't know who they are. So if there's a terrorist attack and it comes from the southern border, I got to believe that's checkmate.
And I don't even know if I mean, look, and obviously that's a pretty intense hypothetical. I don't even know if they necessarily need to go there. The bottom line is that between Afghanistan, Israel, and Ukraine, and the blunders that have happened with the United States around those three conflicts, I could make a very easy and honest argument that Biden has the worst record on foreign policy of any president in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And I can make an easy argument as to why he's even worse than George Bush on the war in Iraq. Because that's one. Biden's got three. It's a huge problem for him politically, and I think my hunch is that while you're not seeing that in polling, voters are thinking about that in a way that they are concerned, and Biden is not doing anything to ease those concerns.
Yeah, and I think that it is also safe to say that when they look at the two candidates, and I've seen so many interviews with just like man on the street, undecided type of voters that seem pretty sincerely like not political, not in a partisan camp, but they're like, look, I've seen him say, I'm not that excited about President Trump, that people will say this, and I didn't vote for him 4 years ago, but I'm going to tell you, I want peace and prosperity again. I want the inflation to go away. That's what I want. That's what we had. That's what I want. And they don't feel like there's any chance that Joe Biden's going to get better. The things that he's going to suddenly become this competent administrator that delivers excellent results, which actually I think leads us to one of the topics that we wanted to raise today, which is there's two parties, there's two candidates. I'm with you now. I think that the whole idea of replacing Biden is over.
I finally won you over on that one.
You did. It was the State of the Union speech, because that was his opportunity. Like if he had blown that and looked like a complete, gibbering fool, then I think he might have actually had people at that moment in time. There was a window where they could have done something, but he did well enough by just yelling and giving a campaign speech that pleased partisan progressives instead of a statesman-like speech as president, that I think he survived. And now it's a matter of just the mechanics of all of this. Something major would have to happen. He'd have to withdraw himself. It's not going to happen, or his wife's not going to let it happen. And or there would have to be some news that somebody that on his side of the fence would leak that would just destroy him. And I don't even know if that would work right now, because expectations are pretty low. People are supporting him, and they know he can't string sentences together. They know that he's not really making decisions and running things, and he trips and falls all the time and all that stuff. And they don't care, right? So they're just going to stick with him because he's the incumbent.
Yeah.
But two questions: we have a Republican vice president pick that has to take place, and then a question about, are they going to stick with Kamala on the Democrat side?
Yeah, we'll stick with Kamala. We'll stick with Kamala. So
no matter what. Even though they're down 13 points in Nevada.
I mean, I don't. So here's my thing when it comes to VP picks. And I'll say this in the context of the presidential race. I've never been a believer that your VP pick gives you a massive bump in the polls and like edges, increases your probability of winning or losing in any real way.
Yeah.
The way I always think about it is, if the presidential candidate is the CEO, the VP is kind of the COO. And they're obviously playing second fiddle to the president, both if they're elected and they become the VP, but also on the campaign too. But their real function, and if I were managing a campaign, I was a part of the pick. There's a few things that I think that matter. One, the one we always talk about: are they capable of doing the job? If they, they're one heartbeat away from the presidency, are they capable of being president of the United States?
Yeah.
I think that's always the first good hurdle to jump over. Once you've jumped over that hurdle, and you can start thinking about more like sort of the political calculus of it all. Are they someone that believes in the message, and can help convey the message of the presidential campaign to voters? They are a surrogate for the presidential candidate. They're out there meeting with donors to raise money. They're out there doing events to generate some grassroots support with the base, or they're doing media interviews to get earned media for the campaign. Are they going to be functionally good at all of those things? And are they going to sort of stay on topic and stay on course and stay on message with the campaign? Those to me are the most important things. Everything else, in terms of what state they're from or what demographic they are, all of that is worth talking about, but is a distant third to the first two that I laid out.
Yeah, I think, and there was a time when they used to try and geographically balance out tickets or shore up a weakness. Say Kennedy was from Massachusetts, but they needed a Southerner to keep the solid South on board and turn out. So they got LBJ from Texas. There was that, but now the geography really doesn't matter too much, right? And are they a good messenger in the age of television, where people don't even know where sometimes the VP is from, unless they're from that home state? And then I think there can be a perception that they make up for something that some voters may perceive a candidate lacks. And so Mike Pence kind of reassured base conservatives in 2016, who might still have been a little leery of President Trump. But then that was completely different years later, when President Trump had done so much to deliver conservative results as president, in the face of vociferous Democrat opposition. So a Mike Pence-like vice president, it might be safe to have someone like him, though I know he's not in the running this time. But that doesn't, President Trump doesn't have the same need at this point.
Correct.
Right?
No, I don't think there's a need there. And to your point on geography, I mean, it definitely matters way less than it did 20 or 30 years ago, or certainly prior to then. I mean, I live in the state of Georgia, using Georgia as an example now. If you're to say, hey, we need to have someone from Georgia because Georgia residents will have an effect. Well, the reality is you have so many transplants, myself included, in the greater Atlanta area that aren't from here. So it's not like if you pick a Georgian, all of a sudden, you've stolen a piece of my heart. You are, and you can think of that all over the country. How many snowbirds are there in Arizona or Florida? How many people, have moved to Palm Springs or all these other different parts of the country, or how many people have moved out of California into Texas? More so than any other time in our country, our geographics are very fluid. We move around more than any generation ever has. So again, I think in terms of needs if we're talking about the Trump campaign specifically, I don't think there's no immediate need that strikes me, other than, are they going to be a good surrogate for the president? Are they going to go on media interviews and do a good job? Are they going to articulate the president's message and the campaign's plan, or in the vice presidential debates? Are they going to go out and be able to raise money from high dollar donors? Are they going to be able to go and command a room of grassroots supporters and get them energized? If they can do all those things, then whether they're a governor or a senator or whether they're from Florida or North Dakota, all that matters a lot less to me, I think. And I think it matters to, I should say me. The reason I think it matters less to me is because I don't think the rest matters as much to voters as we think it does.
Well, what about race, ethnicity, and gender? Because sometimes, even if it's not necessarily that you're trying to add a dimension to your ticket, although there's a lot of fanfare that goes along with like, oh, this is exciting and all that stuff. But what about reducing an advantage your opponent has? So you think of, say, a Tim Scott. Democrats absolutely have to get a certain percentage of the black vote in about 5 of the 6 swing states, or they can't win. Does he change that at all if it were him?
So obviously, I mean, it would be historic if someone like Tim Scott were the pick, and obviously became, the first Republican African American vice president. So there are some benefits to thinking about. Like I said earlier, like these things are worth discussing if you're a presidential campaign, because there's some value there. I don't mean to diminish the value too much, in the sense that you can talk about it. It makes for a good line in a debate. It makes for a good press release. Maybe there's some donors that are energized about it. I'm not convinced that, depending on the ethnicity or the demographics of the pick, all of a sudden you're going to see this magnetic shift of, now we're going to get, a historic number of African American votes because we picked Tim Scott, or we're going to get more females because we picked Kristi Noem. That I don't think will happen. Part of my evidence for that is that you're seeing that happen before he's made the pick. Like if you look at the polling for President Trump right now, and this has been happening over a long period of time, we're seeing more and more support from Hispanic voters than we've ever seen. He's never picked a Hispanic vice presidential nominee. Yeah. We're seeing record support for President Trump amongst African Americans, especially amongst African American males. He hasn't picked Tim Scott yet. We're seeing less support from suburban white women. I don't think that stops because he picks a female U.S. senator or a female governor. Those trends are happening because those trends, in terms of how demographics sort of writ large support political candidates, those are tectonic shifts. Those aren't things that happen quickly because of one candidate or another.
So it's all more on the margins where something like that might make a difference, but not enough necessarily to swing a whole election or reverse a trend. Now, is it?
Well, just interrupt real quick. Sorry. I mean, just to cover all my bases here. If President Trump picks Tim Scott, and for some reason we only win South Carolina by 1 vote, then yeah, Tim Scott made a difference there, right? Like he helped us get them, and obviously, I mean, South Carolina is a safe red seat, but maybe I'll use a different story. I'll use DeSantis. For example, if we were to pick Ron DeSantis, and we were able to win Florida, by 1 vote, yeah, DeSantis had an impact there, right? Like if this is a super close election, those small things, when it comes to these sort of window dressing things about where they're from or their ethnicity or their demographics, the closer the race, the more that could potentially matter. But it's not those things are not as important as the sort of team player carrying the message, raising the money factors first. You have to figure those out before you go and think about the other things.
Yep. And that they don't create unexpected issues where because you don't want the vice president to be the story. Otherwise you might have a problem, right? I don't even know if there's enough oxygen in the room for somebody to steal from Trump if the vice presidential pick has to understand a lot of the attention is going to be focused on it. But you know what? He could well be picking the 2028 nominee. And I'm sure some people are thinking about that.
Well, yes. Absolutely. Whoever he picks, especially if he wins, regardless of the results in November, but especially if he wins in November, that person has a strong potential to be the front runner for the next presidential election, no doubt. Yeah. But it'll be interesting. I mean, obviously, the Republican National Convention is just a few weeks away, just over a month now, like maybe 5.5, 6 weeks, I think. So we're getting close.
Yeah, yeah, and that's why we know we're going to know probably either just before in the coming weeks who it is, because there's always this sort of barnstorming effect if you name it a few weeks out. Um, Trump likes drama. He could make it that he wants this to be the thing that everybody tunes into the convention for. And he's been saying, I mean, I get the fundraising emails like, help me pick my vice president. And by the way, donate $100. It really is happening as a drama that they try to get people wrapped up in. So there are dramas happening in these other races. We saw some things happening here in Oregon that are pretty interesting. And one of the ones that came out just after Election Day is in the 4th District. There is the incumbent Val Hoyle, who's, to put it mildly, had some issues that she's really mired herself in that relate to her dealings with the cannabis company Lamoda and the one that brought down the Secretary of State Shemia Fagan. And both Lamoda and Shemia Fagan are under federal investigation. Effectively, Val Hoyle's activities relating to Lamoda are also under investigation. They've been subpoenaed by the feds from when she was the Bureau of Labor and Industry commissioner, the head of it. And it's also been revealed in national reporting that she was the ringleader pushing the whole thing through, actually coaching this marijuana company, all to give them a $500,000 grant using federal money, which is illegal to do, and in exchange for $5,800 in campaign donations. But when you think you can just do this stuff and get away with it, I guess it all seems fine at the time. But it has culminated now in something that you and I pay attention to and the general public doesn't. The political reporters pay attention to, and it is after the primary and after there was a clear Republican opponent that had emerged, certainly a strong one by many measures, Monique Despain, the retired Air Force colonel. Val Hoyle quietly was added to a list called the Frontline list. And it's usually a good thing if you're a Democrat challenging a Republican incumbent to be added to the frontline list, because that means they're going to focus on you and they're going to help you and you're going to get extra resources and fundraising. But when you're an incumbent Democrat, it's not so great, at least to be added to it. And they didn't do a press release. They just added her. And then some people happened to be looking at the website and spotted it. And this made news here in Oregon. The Oregon Capital Chronicle picked up on it and just pointed out how actually this might mean that they're worried. Democrats said a few weeks ago, I don't know if you heard about this, they do this Wayne Morris Gala. It's their big fundraiser that they do, kind of like Lincoln Day dinner or something for a Republican party. They did it in Portland. They had the Hamas protesters, the pro-Hamas protesters, beating on the windows outside while Jeff Merkley gave a speech inside along with some others. And I forget who's the attorney general from Minnesota was there trying to calm the crowd. The guy who's pretty radical himself. But anyway, but they said to their donors, the road to control of Congress, getting back into the majority from their perspective, runs through Oregon. Now, that's unusual because Oregon is not usually the place where the rest of the country goes and sees what's going to happen with Congress or with anything nationally.
Right.
But this actually might be the case, and this might be one of the races.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the fact that Val Hoyle is now a frontline Democrat, it shows that we get the term campaign in politics from war, right? Military campaigns,
yeah,
right? So so if you think of war analogies, I mean, the front line is a fluid thing, right? Depending on how well the military campaign is going. it is clear at this point the campaign broadly for Democrats is not going well. And so their front line has gotten pushed back a little bit to where now folks like Val Hoyle are in danger. And even when that was, a relatively semi-competitive, but frankly kind of safe seat for the last 20 years or so, or maybe 10, 15. That is, and you're seeing that in other parts of the country where I think more and more Democrats, whether it's in eastern Pennsylvania or it's pockets of North Carolina, Democrats are having a harder and harder time rectifying why they deserve to get reelected. And again, it kind of ties back to the beginning of this conversation. On one hand, all they want to do is talk about Donald Trump, and voters are like, "Hey, listen, that's not great. Donald Trump's not the reason I can't afford my electric bill this month.
He's not president right now.
Yeah, Donald Trump's not the reason, that I've got a homeless encampment down the street from my house. It's not the reason that my kids saw a meth pipe in the street last week. Those aren't his problem. Like, Donald Trump didn't do that. What are you going to do to fix it?" And their response is orange man bad, right? So that's a part of the problem that Democrats are facing. And it's one of the reasons the line's moving. And the other reason too is that their top of the ticket, Joe Biden, is not doing them any favors. I mean,
yeah,
I can't think
he's the lodestone around their necks, kind of.
Right. I mean, there's very little I can think of that if I'm a Democrat, I'm thinking, wow, I'm really glad Biden did that today. I mean, I'll be honest. The only thing I can think of off the top of my head that Democrats are probably excited about, they feel like it helped them politically, was maybe some of the stuff they did on student loan debt. On student, and again, I'm not saying I agree with the policy or anything, but
which is unconstitutional.
If you're a Democrat and you've got people in your district that got free government money or had their debt relieved, that's probably the only politically good thing that, like, if you're Val Hoyle or any of these other Democrats, you're kind of like, oof, thanks. Everything else has been a disaster, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's the border, whether it's crime, whether it's anything, whether it's just completing a full string of sentences. None of that's worked well for them. So Democrats have a lot of problems. So to your point, it's not shocking that someone like Val Hoyle is added to that list. My guess is that it continues to get a little easier. It gets tougher for them, and maybe Val Hoyle has a few more friends on that list in the months to come.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, and it's kind of interesting to think about what has happened as Democrats. They seem to be doing some contortions right now to run away from some of the things they were doing, but they've done the opposite of lull their opponents' supporter base to sleep. They have done things that have infuriated and motivated. I mean, if they wanted Republicans not to turn out, they probably aren't doing it the right way, because
Right.
they've just made them angrier and more likely to turn out. And now there's a chunk of independents, moderates, that are starting to act a little bit more like that, which is why we've seen some of the polling shift, right?
Right. No.
Well, that's just sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with you. And then I'm also, I apologize for yawning. You are captivating. You're I'm a captive audience. But it is going on 10 o'clock on the East Coast, so I'm getting a little drowsy over here.
Little punch drunk. All right. Yeah, I know that. I hear you. Well, I really appreciate you coming on with us here. And I know we covered a whole swath of stories, both Oregon related and national. In the next say 30 days, what would you say you wanted to tell people? Okay, watch this. This is important. Not everybody might be thinking about this, but this is what I'm watching.
It's a good question. First thing that comes to mind is pay attention to what's said at the Republican National Convention, obviously by President Trump, but also by other Republicans there. I think that the National Convention is a lot of things. One of the things that I think it is the opening salvo for the general election. It is Republicans starting to lay their case for why people need to vote for Republicans in November. So pay close attention to that, as I'm sure many of your listeners will. I think in terms of the next 30 days, um, you know, the only other thing I think that's really worth paying attention to, that listeners might not be, is right now it might kind of feel like the Israeli Gaza conflict is kind of like in this sort of stasis. Like, it's kind of been the same news for the last couple months now. Um, I expect that to start to change, and I do expect, if not in the next 30 days, certainly before November, there is going to be another foreign policy blunder by the Joe Biden administration. And it's probably going to be related in some way to the Middle East, whether it's through Israel or Iran or Gaza, something like that. I think that's going to be that, to me, is kind of like the big bugaboo out there for the Democrats that hasn't been accounted for yet. That, if I had to bet money, is going to happen in the months to come.
So there's an Easter egg in waiting someplace in the foreign policy milieu that could, bust open.
I just feel like it is, and I don't have I don't have any security clearance. It's not like I know something that you don't. I just from looking at world history and just kind of understanding American politics, something's going to happen on a foreign policy level that's going to become a major discussion between now and November. It could be out of something changes dramatically in the war in Ukraine. Something changes dramatically with the war in Israel, or perhaps there's a new front that's opened up, whether it's with China and Taiwan. I feel like there is going to be something else major that happens in the world that's going to have an impact on this election in some way, shape, or form.
Well, we will stay tuned for the unknown that could happen, and that this is the only thing we know about from the most recent election cycles. We don't know what's going to actually end up shaping the final numbers, right? So we can't assume anything.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much coming on, Dave. As always, it's great having you on and sharing your insights and wisdom, and we will look forward to having you on here in the coming couple of months as everything develops and as you work hard. I hope you get some rest. I know we've deprived you of some of that tonight, but for the fight ahead, keep doing the Lord's work that you've been doing.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
All right. And thanks everyone for watching. Share the show with everyone you can, and we'll see you on the next episode of The Captive Audience tomorrow.